In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
Today, I'm talking with Julia Steinberger, Professor of Ecological Economics at the University of Leeds. And tell me if this is right, Julia, a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is that right?
Yes, I'm one of the lead authors, so one of many. And I don't speak on behalf of the IPCC because nobody does, the reports do.
Yeah.
So.
And both your parents were Nobel laureates, is that right?
That's news to me.
That's not right.
One of my parents is a Nobel laureate, Jack Steinberger. My mom maybe should have been. I don't know.
I'm pretty sure your Wikipedia page says they're both Nobel laureates.
Wow, cool. I shall not correct that. That's for sure.
And you've got a PhD from MIT, and you work on things like the cosmic microwave background of the universe and quantum electrodynamics and that sort of stuff. I mean, that's not what I want to talk about.
I definitely need to check that Wikipedia page. I do have a PhD in physics from MIT, but I think some of these things sound a bit more glamorous than they should be, probably.
Okay. Oh, you'd lose me very quickly if you talk about that sort of stuff anyway. What I want to talk to you about is your work on ecological economics. What's happening to the global environment, the consequences of that for humans, and about GDP growth and its desirability. I read some of your articles. I especially like the timeline one, which took us back to the Miocene. I also watched you on YouTube. I love what you're saying. I especially liked a couple of things. First is your recognition that all the lovely things that greenies would like to happen are going to face opposition from very wealthy, very powerful people who will lose some of their wealth and power if these things happen. And I don't know if you find this, but I certainly find a lot of people say we should do this or we should do that, as though we only have to provide the information, and when enough people get it, things will change, as if there aren't very powerful people out there who are not going to let it happen. But why do you think that's so difficult for a lot of greenies to see?
I think actually, so I think that's a combination of two things. One is that at the beginning of the sort of big green environmental movement, say at the founding of the United Nations Environmental Program, at the beginning when people started to realize that climate change was happening, the environment was something that was taken seriously by politicians and to some extent by business people, and was put very front and center, and was not controversial in that sense. So it was something that the Rio Summit for the Earth was a big deal. Somebody was just reminding people on Twitter about this. Stephen Barlow, I think, who hundreds of heads of state showed up. It was the biggest head of state gathering pretty much ever. So at the beginning, at some point in the past, it would not have been a delusional belief to think that everybody was actually going to take this seriously and do something about it, because everybody was saying the right things, and to some extent even doing the right things, passing legislation on water, on air, cleaning up the hole in the ozone layer. Those things happened. There was mobilization for them, but also the politicians took them seriously and did them. Now, slight problem, these things were not as hard to tackle in terms of what they do to the economy as climate change. So climate change is a full frontal challenge, and I don't think that was taken seriously. Yeah. So I think there's one thing which is sort of a history of being kind of okay to be apolitical, because good things happened in environmental movements in the past in terms of environmental goals. And the other thing is that I would say, in terms of not wanting to see the political aspect of what we're up against, is that sustainable development was presented as apolitical. It was a very much like have your cake and eat it too kind of framing of the problem, which was compelling to everybody, because to some extent nobody wants a fight. So it's like, okay, if we just use the word sustainable development and we just go forward try to have, you know, green growth, decoupling, whatever it is.
Well, that's the,
We'll get there. We'll get what we won't. We don't need that fight. We're not in a strong position as environmentalists. Let us not go out and seek that fight that we might not win. Let's just be nice to each other. And I think that framing was probably, in hindsight, kind of disastrous.
Yeah, and that brings me on to the second thing that I liked about what you were saying, and that's not enough sort of change-oriented people. I don't like to say left or right, but not enough people who really want change are saying, they're not saying enough about GDP growth. So you've looked into climate change a lot, obviously, and my question is, can there be a solution to climate change within a sort of perpetually growing global economy?
No.
No.
Did you want more words to associated with that? I think
quite possibly, yes. I mean, so many people just can't see that, though.
I think that I think people have wanted to see it, and you know, myself at the beginning of my career, so I switched careers a lot, I switched topics a lot, and at the beginning I was like, okay, let's look for this green growth thing, let's see where it happens, let's see, maybe it's in some sectors, maybe it's here, maybe it's there. I looked for it and could convince myself that it just wasn't happening out there in reality, and stopped looking for it. But that's been happening more and more. So I think that now we're really seeing not just individual studies, but meta studies, so really comprehensive, exhaustive ones. So there was one by Hickel and Callas last year. There was a couple that came out recently by Helmut Haberl and Dominic Wiedenhofer, which are devastating. So they're both open access. They're in environmental research letters. They're part 1, part 2. And they just go over the entire scope of published evidence on this and come back and say, no way. And we really need to be thinking about this very differently. So for me, those were those nails in the coffin. I mean, this is, there was another study by Otero et al., by Iago Otero and his colleagues, on biodiversity. So not just climate change or resource use, but biodiversity and its links to economic growth. And they're just saying, we have to do conservation differently. If we care about species conservation, we care about biodiversity conservation, we have to take seriously the fact that economic growth is driving biodiversity loss. And here's all the evidence, and think about it. So I think that just in the past couple of years, really devastatingly strong studies have come out. So now I feel very confident that I can just say no.
But are you optimistic that it might sort of nudge towards the mainstream at some point? I mean, you know, it's one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, number 8, is economic growth, sustainable economic growth. Yeah.
I think that that's something that we're getting close to. We're probably not going to be fast enough. I mean, I'm not optimistic. I don't believe in hope or those things. It's not my personality, and it's not my job.
Right, that was something I was going to ask you. That's something I was going to ask you a bit later on. But yeah.
Well, we can get back to it. But the thing is, I think in terms of, we're getting much better at articulating why economic growth, or how economic growth and social and progress and environmental sustainability are completely different things. And that we should not, we're sort of learning to tell ourselves and tell each other the story of why economic growth is not the same as good things. And in fact, has a lot of bad things associated with it. You know, Thomas Piketty, the most eminent economist of our generation, and probably a couple in the past, has really shown that economic growth is accompanied by widening inequality. And growth happens. Where does that growth come from? The growth accrues to the wealthy. That's one of the things he showed. Where does it come from? It comes from impoverishing the lower classes who don't have assets anymore. So you're seeing this very real phenomenon where the poorest levels of society have net negative wealth, because basically the system runs on debt now, where you're basically making rich people richer by having household debt at the poorest levels. And we're in this financial system, and that's how it grows these days. So we're learning to tell each other the story of how growth is economically, socially, and environmentally disastrous, and how we can do good things differently. But we're possibly not telling that story fast enough.
What term do you favor? Steady state, degrowth, post-growth, and why?
I'm very opportunistic. I'd probably be happy with any of those terms. I'm quite happy with degrowth. I'm quite happy with post-growth. Steady state, I think, is not possible because right now we're headed for a period of very large instability, just sort of pragmatically. So maybe we would have a sort of long-term goal of a steady state economy, but I don't think that that's in our near or medium future. I think that right now we have to be facing a period of very, very, very fast and strong degrowth, certainly on the physical resource use side, if we want to have a chance of maintaining stable climatic conditions that allow us to have things like agriculture. So
yeah, I think it's
quite happy with degrowth in that sense.
Yeah, it's just that it's a harder sell, isn't it? Degrowth. It makes people think, oh, I have to give things up immediately, which they probably do.
So the thing is, we're going up against a hegemon, right? So economic growth is this hegemonic concept that sort of sits in the middle of our societies. And the problem with any term, a lot of people say, oh, I don't like degrowth because it's negative. But everything else gets co-opted by growth, because growth is the sort of Moloch, the god in the middle of it's our secular deity, right? And it is dominant. And it will sort of swallow everything else, sustainable growth, green growth, equitable growth, inclusive growth, everything becomes part of growth. So if you're going up against the hegemon, you kind of have to fly that flag. And so that's one of the reasons I'm happy with degrowth. It makes people think. And I think one of the things that they do is the first couple of times they hear it, they go, oh, not nice. And then they think, oh, well, why would anybody want something not nice? And then they think about it more, read about it more. And I think it's something that people come to terms with. I've seen fairly rapidly. I've seen Americans come to terms with it.
I guess we're only talking about a small percentage of the population. I don't think the mainstream are going to come to terms with any of those terms, really. I don't think they're going to even confront them.
Maybe. I don't know. I'm very hopeful in the sense that I'm seeing, there are these popular movements that involve a lot of people, including the student strikes. Greta Thunberg went up and gave an anti-growth speech at the UN, right? She literally mentioned, "You're doing this for economic growth. How dare you?" Yeah.
Ecological. Sorry.
And also the Sunrise Movement in the U.S. and a lot of people who are associated with democratic socialists. So it's sort of the left wing of the Democratic Party, who are sort of bigger and bolder than they've ever been. Some of them are very unhappy with degrowth, and some of them are quite comfortable with it, especially if they consider themselves to be eco-socialists. So I'm not saying that everybody's going to go around using that term. I think that it's people who are part of the conversation are learning to bring it further.
Ecological economics, forgive my ignorance, is it a specific discipline? Can you get a degree in ecological economics?
If you go to the University of Leeds, which I'm sadly leaving right now, yes, you can get a master's in ecological economics. Absolutely.
And do all ecological economists see the absurdity of perpetual growth, or even there, are there some people who believe that we can continue to grow?
Ecological economics has not ever made a statement per se against economic growth. So there's some people who think that some parts of the economy could still grow. So in general, people do distinguish growth and progress, and they certainly would agree that some parts of the economy need to degrow. And that's actually really interesting, because that's a mainstream economic statement now. So after coronavirus and because of the climate crisis, that was a statement made by hundreds of Dutch economists. We need to deliberately degrow some sectors of the economy.
Right.
And that's a very strong statement.
I know that some organizations, for example, the New Economics Foundation, they haven't come out against growth. It's more like GDP growth isn't everything. I mean, it's the same with Kate Raworth and the donut economics. It doesn't say we can't continue to have GDP growth. It says it's not everything, which really isn't the same thing.
Well, it's about turning away from that metric as a metric of social progress. So, and I think that these intermediates are very important, by the way. So I'm very much in favor of there being a spectrum of debate, because it allows that debate to happen across that larger fraction of the population.
Yeah.
So very pragmatically, I admire Kate Rayworth's work. I admire the work of the New Economics Foundation. I think there's a lot of strong points there. And the fact that they're sort of taking the middle ground of saying some parts, again, Kate Rayworth and the New Economics Foundation will have no problem saying some parts of the economy need to degrow. You're talking about a Green New Deal. You're saying some sectors, specifically fossil fuel sectors and adjacent industries, need to degrow to nothing.
To nothing at all, yeah. And I mean,
and we need to grow other stuff, right? So, so I think that having that perspective of being willing to say that, and being willing to put it in a positive picture of a whole economy that is socially just, equitable, sustainable, everybody has a job, that kind of thing, is really important, without necessarily using the words degrowth.
Yeah. I mean, how do you think we might best get it across to people? I mean, it's still a minority position, and I know a lot of intelligent people who just don't get it at all. They think I'm crazy if I start talking about it. And you hear on Radio 4 all the time, how are we going to get back to growth? How are we going to get back to growth? Yeah. How do we start getting through?
Well, I've never been asked on Radio 4, but I don't know. I think that that position is the pro-growth position is very strong, and for some people it's still, the sun rises in the morning, good things come from growth.
Yeah.
But the fraction of people who understand differently has grown by leaps and bounds, and I would say now includes large chunks of mainstream economists. Not all mainstream economists, but certainly, enough for hundreds of them in the Netherlands to sign a letter.
Yeah.
But and I've been signing similar things in the UK, across Europe. So they're, at least within the academic professional sphere, I think that sentiment is, for lack of a better word, growing. And it's grown by leaps and bounds. So the acceptance that we need a fundamentally different economy is growing by leaps and bounds. In just the last year, people have been making progress and sort of being able to understand and talk about it in ways that I hadn't seen before. And just being much bolder and more uncompromising in terms of what articulating what this means, that it doesn't mean negative things, but that it means necessary things. And I hope that coronavirus helps with that as well, is that when we take something seriously as a public health crisis and we want to save lives, then we do stuff differently. And climate is a lot worse than coronavirus. Not right now, but it will be soon enough. And we can still stop it. We can still stop that big problem, or we can stop it its worst incarnation.
I mean, I often hear that growth can be dematerialized. And it sort of drives me insane. I mean, growth means more spending power. And if there's not an increase in spending power, there hasn't been growth. And so if you have increase in spending power, then there's no way to ring fence it so that it's not spent on material things. It can't be dematerialized.
So these two articles that I mentioned by Wiedenhofer et al. And Haberl et al. In environmental research letters, they look at everything. They look at emissions and resource use, so materials and energy and emissions, and across the board, dematerialization not happening.
No.
So,
yeah. So here's another big question. Can we take the growth out of capitalism, or will it require an entirely new economic system?
The reason we have growth is capitalism. That's another thing. It actually goes the other way around. So capitalism is a system based on competition. So firms do not have a choice. They are competing in the market, and because of that, and they have a motive of profit accumulation. That's what they're there for. So they're competing, and they need to accumulate more. And the only way that firms survive in that context is on a basis of growth. So growth is something that allows firms to survive. Because otherwise they would go bust. So lack of capitalism is a crisis. And growth is a stabilization mechanism of capital that allows crises to be pushed forward and forward and forward into the future, just even a little bit. And so that's what we're living. So it's not a question of can we take growth out of capitalism, is the reason that we have this growth imperative is because we are in a capitalist system that can't cope otherwise. And it's something that, as a physicist, let me tell you, one of the craziest things as a physicist is going into economics and saying, okay, so where are your alternative models of what a macroeconomy will look like that doesn't need to grow? And people look at you like you've just sprouted 5 other heads, right?
Yeah.
Green antennas. And it's like, you guys didn't even bother to model a non-growing economy. Like, maybe that's what you have now, but you didn't even bother to model something differently, like in your mind, in your computer. You just, I know, it's a religion. I mean, that's when you realize that it's not a science.
Yeah.
Because there is really this fixation on this is what the system should be, and a refusal to consider alternatives. Because, in fact, when you drill down, when you understand what's going on in terms of the substructure of the economy, capitalism does not have other options.
Yeah.
So
And
it's not possible to have capitalism in a non-growing setting.
Yeah.
Because it's that results in crises. That results in too many firms going bust, and it's sort of it's sort of a downward spiral. So degrowth can be fine. It does mean getting rid of capitalism. Life.
Yeah, I guess this competition means that firms have to advertise to gain new customers, but the advertising also has the effect of increasing consumption overall. It can't do anything else.
So do you know Steinberg and Gold?
No.
And the treadmill of production. So they were American sociologists, which basically had a Marxian perspective on the economy, and they basically said, if you look at what the economy is really doing, it's not, we have this idealized version that the consumer demands stuff and produce for consumer demand. What they were saying is actually, if you look at the real structural imperatives, if you look at what these institutions are doing with each other, they are, the fact that producers have overproduction means that they need to create demand. And that's what they're doing with advertising. It's what they do by market expansion. They have all these different mechanisms to create demand.
Yeah.
And one of the things we looked at in a study that I did, we looked at the creation of automobile dependence.
Yeah.
So looking at the car as the central product of our era, and you see all these different ways that the product is not the car. The product is car dependence. It's making that demand exist in society and removing other options from people's lives.
Yeah. Nobody ever woke up and thought, you know what, I want a razor blade. I want a razor with 5 blades. Nobody ever thought that. It was a sort of nobody ever thought I want bluey whiteness in my sheets. Nobody ever thought that. It was all sort of generated by the advertising industry.
Yeah.
But I mean, but countries are in global competition to attract capital, which is why they're not going to do that with a stable or shrinking GDP. So they sort of have to go all out for economic growth.
The word countries is doing a lot of work in that statement. So it's true what you said, but I think we have to consider who within countries is doing this. So one of the things we see inequality around the world between countries, but we also see inequality within countries as well. And when we're talking about countries' need to attract capital, we're talking about a fairly small population within each country, which actually benefits from that foreign capital and the financial entanglements it brings. Whereas the rest of the population suffers under structural adjustment programs, has to pay school fees, has their food becoming more expensive, rent becoming more expensive. So you have this sort of polarization and impoverishment that goes with global capital having access to a domestic market. And it's really interesting how actually again, sociologists just published a paper showing how the World Bank and the IMF were transformed away from their original purpose and towards opening up foreign markets for capital in a very, in the sort of American way of leading to structural adjustment programs and those kinds of things. And it's really interesting. And it was a deliberate shift that was driven by big financial firms in the US. And they sort of told the politicians what to do or the diplomats what to do, and that's what happened.
I heard another argument recently, which I'm ashamed to say I'd never thought about before, but it's a technical innovation means that labor productivity constantly rises, which means that the economy has to grow to maintain full employment.
Yeah, and Tim Jackson makes that point really well in Prosperity Without Growth as well. Labor productivity is a huge lever. David Harvey is another person who talks about it in a Marxian perspective. So technological innovation is not neutral. Technological innovation is the types that are developed and adopted are ones that enable more profits to be made in a certain way. And one way you make profits is you make profits off of labor productivity.
Yeah.
So you change the way that labor allows you to make profits, and that's how you make money, and that's how technology is invested. And so this the technical dynamism that we see is not neutral here. It is going to cause the system to expand.
Yeah.
In those kinds of ways.
As you started to say that, I found myself wanting to do this, but there are only two of us, so I don't need to do that. So we need a new system. How do we actually say this? Well, I mean, most people would. You start talking about getting rid of capitalism, and people instantly think you're a Stalinist.
They do, don't they? Which is kind of interesting because, you know, a lot of people are not Stalinists and still think that capitalism is a horribly bad idea. Again, this is really interesting. Within ecological economics, I once gave a talk where we talked about inequality and capitalism and things like that. And I remember somebody just getting up and saying the Soviet Union was a failure. And just like,
yeah, exactly.
Okay, interesting free association. So that idea is there very strongly. And how do we get around it? I think one of the ways we get around, we confront it is we have to confront it directly and talk about all the ways in which we're not going to be at all like Soviet Russia, because Soviet Russia and China right now, by the way, China right now is a complete horror show, environmentally, socially, economically, you name it. In terms of democracy, it's a very bad actor as well. So we have to talk about these things openly. And I think one of the main concepts we need to get across is that of economic democracy. So the alternative to capitalism is not, you know, state-imposed central planning with a few people making all the decisions. It's actually something where we bring the economy into the civil sphere, into the civic sphere. So we're talking about services. This is something that Neff talks about as well. When we talk about universal basic services, or we talk about the services that people really need to live, like water, transport, food, energy, housing, these are things that we can own and deliver democratically on a community basis, using sort of different networked approaches of organizations doing it slightly differently. But there are a whole bunch of beautiful, wonderful ideas that exist in practice. You can see how they are being done very successfully in practice that have this economic democracy element to them. And that's what we need across the board. So we basically need to move to that model. And you know, the funny thing is that, you know, the same people who say, oh, we don't want Soviet Russia, they're the same people who really would like to join a credit union, who really would like to be part of a housing association or a housing cooperative because the rent's cheaper, or who would really want to, or who participate in having their veg box delivered.
So I was involved in a public debate recently. They asked me to give the sort of the anti-capitalist sort of side of things, and my opponent said he was very pro-capitalist, and as the debate went on, it turns out he's a member of a community energy scheme and a community-supported agriculture scheme. And I said, whoa, stop. You think that's capitalism? You think that's capitalism? He says, yes, it's a free market. I said, oh, so you think capitalism is a free market? He said, yes. I said, oh, okay. So if you think, if you're in favor of community-supported agriculture and community energy, then let's not argue anymore. If you think that's capitalism, fine, let's do that. But I don't think it's capitalism.
Nope, absolutely not. And it's because capitalism is about profit accumulation to a few actors. Yeah. And all of these community schemes have the idea of reinvestment, and that's what we need right now. We need this. I mean, in terms of like telling people that we need to transform the system completely, the economic system completely. That's something that the IPCC is shouting from the rooftops. In terms of convincing people that it's something that's desirable for them, I think we need to be making those links between, you know, the good stuff like the community energy scheme, which is great, the housing association, which is great, the cooperative, which is great. You know, that these are the things that we really want. Yeah. And but they have to become mainstream, and we have to shut down alternatives. I mean, I think that that's something that people have a harder time wrapping their heads around. We can convince people that we want to create beautiful alternatives, and everybody's all happy to do that. but the hard work is actually shutting down the big driving forces of badness.
Yeah.
And that's what that needs doing as well. So the alternatives are there, but the thing that's preventing them from becoming the norm is the existence of these other bad actors, bad institutions, bad economic modes of functioning. And so we need, that's I think the harder thing is really convincing people to be up for that fight.